When we talk about waste in a factory, most people just imagine garbage going out of the gate. But for sustainability reporting and ESG, we need to be a bit more careful. We need to know what kind of waste it is and what finally happens to it. Is it hazardous or non-hazardous? Can it be recycled? Does it go to landfill, or is it burnt or turned into something new? In this session, I'm going to explain this in very simple language. First, we'll look at different types of waste. Then we'll look at what happens to that waste, the common disposal methods. By the end, you should be able to correctly classify your waste and select the right disposal option when you enter data in any ESG or sustainability platform. All right, let's start with the types of waste. First, hazardous waste. Hazardous waste is the kind of waste that can easily harm people or the environment. It may be flammable, it may be corrosive, it may be reactive, or it may be toxic. In simple words, this is dangerous waste, and it needs special handling. Think of things like strong solvents and chemicals, leftover paints and dinners, oily sludge from oil traps, or certain industrial residues that contain harmful substances. If you feel this is not safe to touch, it can burn, corrode, or contaminate soil and water, you are probably dealing with hazardous waste. Now, not all waste is so dangerous. A big part of factory waste is much more routine. That brings us to non-hazardous waste. Non-hazardous waste is the more normal, everyday type of waste. It does not pose an immediate risk to health or the environment as long as it is handled properly. This is things like office paper and general trash, cardboard and packaging material, food wrappers from the canteen, and other household-type waste you would see in any office or home. It still needs proper collection and disposal, but it is not chemically dangerous like hazardous waste. Now, some of this waste can actually go back into the system instead of going to landfill. That's where recyclable waste comes in. Recyclable waste is any material that we can collect, process, and use again to make new products. The key idea is use again. Common examples are paper and cardboard, certain plastics, metals like steel and aluminum scrap, and glass bottles and jars. For example, cartons from incoming material can be sent to a recycler to make new paper products. Metal scrap from cutting and machining can be melted and reused. So, whenever a waste material can be turned into something new instead of being thrown away, we call it recyclable waste. Now, another large chunk of waste in factories, especially around canteens and gardens, is what we call organic or biodegradable waste. Organic or biodegradable waste is the kind of waste that can naturally break down or decompose through biological processes. In simple terms, this is the waste that can rot. Typical examples are food waste from the canteen, vegetable peels, leftover meals, garden waste like leaves and grass, and some types of organic sludge. If you put this waste in a compost pit, microorganisms will slowly break it down and turn it into something like soil or compost. On the other hand, some waste does almost nothing. It just sits there. That is what we call inert waste. Inert waste basically does not react, does not burn, and does not decompose very much. Examples include sand and soil, stones and gravel, bricks, tiles, and construction rubble, or broken concrete. If you leave a pile of brick pieces or sand for years, it will look almost the same. That is inert waste. Now, there is one more special category that is becoming more and more important these days. That is e-waste, or electronic waste. E-waste is discarded electrical and electronic equipment and its components. This includes old computers and laptops, mobile phones and tablets, printers and scanners, circuit boards, chargers and cables, and other electronic devices that are no longer in use. E-waste is important because it can contain both valuable metals and hazardous substances like lead and other toxins. So it should not be treated as normal trash. It needs to go to authorized e-waste recyclers. So far, we've talked about different types of waste. Now let's talk about the second big question. What finally happens to this waste after it leaves your site? When we say waste disposal method, we mean the final route the waste takes after it leaves the factory. Does it go to landfill? Does it go for recycling? Is it burnt in an incinerator? This is important for both environmental impact and emission calculations. We'll look at 4 common options: landfill, open-loop recycling, closed-loop recycling, and combustion or incineration. Let's start with the most familiar one, landfill. Landfill is the traditional way of disposing of waste. In a landfill, waste is taken to a designated site, usually with large engineered pits or cells. The waste is dumped, spread out, compacted, and then covered with soil or other material. Landfills are generally used for waste that cannot easily be reused, recycled, or recovered. A proper landfill has systems to manage leachate, which is the dirty liquid that seeps out of waste, and landfill gas, like methane, which is produced as waste breaks down. It also requires long-term environmental monitoring. In simple words, landfill means burying the waste in a controlled and engineered way. Now, instead of burying waste, we may sometimes be able to recycle it, and there are 2 main ways we talk about that. First, open-loop recycling. Open-loop recycling is when a waste material is recycled into a different type of product or material. It does not come back as the same product, but it still gets a second life in another form. For example, plastic bottles may be collected, processed, and turned into textile fibers for clothing, or into plastic lumber for benches. In this case, the plastic has left its original product system. It is no longer a bottle. It has become part of a new system like textiles or construction. That's why we call it open loop. The material moves from one loop into another loop. Now let's look at closed-loop recycling, which is a bit different. Closed-loop recycling is when the waste material is recycled back into the same or a very similar product. For example, glass bottles collected, melted, and turned into new glass bottles. Or aluminum cans that are melted and made into new aluminum cans. Here, the material stays within the same product system. It keeps circulating in that loop again and again. That's why it is called closed-loop recycling. So open-loop material becomes something different. Closed-loop material comes back as the same kind of product. Now, there is one more disposal method that is used for certain types of waste, especially where volume reduction or destruction of hazardous content is needed. This method is combustion, also called incineration. Combustion or incineration means controlled burning of waste at high temperatures in a furnace or incinerator. The main purpose is to reduce the volume of waste and destroy organic or hazardous components. There are 2 common cases here. In the first case, the heat from burning the waste is used to produce steam, heat, or electricity. This is called waste to energy or incineration with energy recovery. In the second case, the waste is burnt, but the heat is not used for anything useful. That is incineration without energy recovery. In both cases, the waste is largely converted into gases and ash. The volume goes down, but emissions must be carefully controlled and reported. So, to summarize, we looked at different types of waste: hazardous, non-hazardous, recyclable, organic or biodegradable, inert, and e-waste. And we looked at common disposal methods: landfill, open-loop recycling, closed-loop recycling, and incineration. If you understand these basics, you'll find it much easier to classify waste correctly and to choose the right disposal method when you are entering data for your sustainability or ESG reports. And more importantly, you'll start seeing where there is a chance to move waste up the ladder, from landfill towards recycling and recovery, and reduce the overall environmental impact of your factory.